we are living in a country where surrounded by this warm tropical waters, and then we get year round sunlight, and everybody thinks that these our oceans are very productive. But in reality, actually they are one of the least productive ecosystem on earth, right, because there is no enough nutrients for the plant or other to grow. So, and we call them as the deserts in the ocean, our tropical oceans, right. But in the same unique this deserts, actually corals thrive. That is one of the fascinating things that we have to talk about, right. So, these corals emerge from these deserts, right, and the corals can turn this desert into one of the most productive ecosystem on earth, and we call them as the rainforests of the ocean. And it's actually amazing to think of how these tiny coral polyps build these amazing structures. So, one of the largest biological built structures on our planet, right, millimeter by millimeter, right. So, it's so amazing to think of that, right. And of course, I think most of the people here gathered today most likely think of that, they thinking of the beauty of the corals, I think, right. Of course, they are beautiful, but more than that, I mean, there are enormous amount of economical and ecological services that provide by the corals, right. So, they are one of the oldest communities that came to the earth. They are so diverse and so strong structures, even they can withstand the mighty storms, right. So, they are well adapted to this thrive in this nutrient poor waters, and they have so much feeding habits, from preying on a tiny organisms to very specific symbiotic relationship with the algae, right. The algae living inside the coral tissue, providing much of the food they want, right. And they have all form of reproductive modes, right. Not only the sexual reproduction, even the asexual reproduction, which usually we do not see in many animals, right. So, even the budding and fragmentation, even a coral break off, they can regrow, right. So, they have even a perfect defense mechanisms, right, from stinging cells. Not only that, even the chemical weapons that even paralyze they can paralyze the organisms, right. So, as a biologist or for ecologist for me, right. So, corals are actually the best group of animal to study about the animals' adaptations, right. So, they are perfectly adapted for the environment where they live, right. So, they like stand as a monument to the perfection of animal adaptation, right. So, all these are true, right. So, they are well adaptive, but the story that we are going to talk about is not really that sweet, right. So, we know that they have been survived, I mean they have survived for millions of years, even very warm waters sometimes, even cold waters. But most of these corals, right, now today that we around the world, they are actually not in good shape. For last maybe 3 to 4 decades, actually most of the coral has been bleached or even dead, right. There are several episodes of coral degradation events, right, and some of the scientists even believe or they speculate that we or our children will be the last generation to see these corals, live corals, right. So, that is so pity, right. So, if they could survive for millions of years in the history, right, and even they have gone through this lot of climatic events, they still could survive, right. Now, the question we have it, why not today, right. So, that is very unique something, right. Why they are not surviving today? So, this is very specific question that we have. So, coral reef in Sri Lanka is no exception, I mean they are all in peril, right. It is same as the other many reefs around the world, right. So, the question I have is, do we really care about our coral reefs, right. So, that is something to think of, right. If this issue is with the Sinharaja forest or even the Vilpattu forest. I mean, we know a lot of people are very sensitive about that. A lot of people talk about and they make a lot of voice about that. But the problem is in the coral reefs, because not many people are aware of this issue, right? And we are not very much familiar with this issue, right? So luckily, everybody in this on stage today actually they have privilege of being underwater, right? They have witnessed this issue for many years, right? So I think there had not been many discussions about this. I mean, there might have, but very recently there had not been any serious discussion on this matter. What are the issues with coral reef? So that is one of the reasons I think Dr. Priyan and we talked about having some sort of a discussion on this particular topic of vanishing reefs and what is ahead, right? To discuss on this matter, of course, this is not, we are not thinking of a hardcore coral forum here, but we just need to understand what is the issues with the corals, right? For today's discussion, we have, of course, we don't need actually a particular introduction, but we have Dr. Asha Vose, right? So she was so generous to join this forum this morning actually, right? So welcome. And then we have Dr. Turney Pradeep. He's a general manager from Marine Environmental Protection Authority, but also he's the academic from the University of Runa from the oceanography. And Mr. Arjan is the coordinator of coastal and marine program at IUCN, but before that he used to be in the NARA, right, what is the prestige institute in Sri Lanka, and he's been working on corals, I think is most of his life. So welcome Arjan. And then we have Mr. Prasanna Weerakkody, right. He is the founder of the Ocean Resource Conservation Association, or the OCA. But a lot of people know him more than coral reef. He is an artist. If you search from the Google, you will see what kind of creations he have. So from wildlife art, like posters to a lot of paintings, you will see, right? So Prasanna. And we have Nishan Pereira. He is the co-founder of the Blue Resource Trust, and he is involved in a lot of conservation projects, as well as a lot of environmental education and other projects, and he has been working in the coral reef state. So without any ado, I think how it's going to happen, Arjan is going to give a small presentation, like give an overall situation in a very short period of time, and then we'll go further into deep.
Thank you very much for this invitation, especially to Dr. Priyan and Dr. Kamal, my good friends. So what I am going to do initially is just a very basic thing about the situation with coral reefs, and based on that the panelists would expand further on their experiences in different subject areas within the coral reef realm. This is basically the importance of coral reefs, and I'm sure all of you know this. It's a very highly diverse environment. It's a productive ecosystem, important for the fisheries industry, for tourism, to protect coastlines, and is also a storehouse of medicinally important compounds and important for research. Looking at the value of these reefs, it's estimated that about 500 million people depend on these reefs for food and employment. Reefs also contribute so many billion annually to world economies through various ways, fisheries, tourism, etc. It's valued around 100 million by the National Oceanographic Administrative of the USA, NOAA. If we look at the amount of coral reefs that's around Sri Lanka, we have very little. We talk about these coral reefs, but This table gives you the extent of reefs in the South Asian region. Maldives has the most. Next comes India, which includes Laccadives, Andaman and Nicobar, in addition to the subcontinent. Then Sri Lanka has a very small amount. Pakistan even less. Bangladesh also very small amount. The corals have been declining very rapidly. In fact, it is called the canary in the coal mine. You may know that in the olden days, miners used to take a canary in a small cage down into the coal mines, because when the air gets bad in the coal mine, the canary begins to struggle, and the miners come to know that it's time to get out of the mine. So it's the first indicator of bad air inside the mine and what's going to happen next. Corals are also one of the first to indicate that something is going wrong with the environment. In this case, particularly the ocean warming, which you will see in the next few slides. So corals have been declining very, very rapidly. You can see in this graph, the blue line, as a result of environmental change. So why are they dying? As Dr. Kamal said earlier, they are dying primarily at this present time because of the sea surface temperature increases, warming due to global warming, climate change and all of that. And there are many other causes, such as destructive fishing, overharvesting of resources, pollution, sediment, physical damage, and also there are a number of invasive species. These will be elaborated by the experts in the panel. So just a few pictures to show you what blast fishing can look like, and then all the other damage that's caused to the reefs, and pollution of our coasts from different areas of the country. And then look at the red area, the increasing of the sea surface temperature, which is a primary cause of actually coral bleaching and death of reefs, which has become one of the biggest threats to coral reefs' existence today. So bleaching can be due to many, many situations. It can be the temperature, it can be excessive sedimentation, fresh water, inorganic nutrients, chemical pollution, and pathogens, and all of that. So this happens because there is a symbiotic relationship between a single-celled algae called the zooxanthellae and the coral polyp. And this relationship breaks down due to stress factors. So as a result, corals lose their color, which we call bleaching. And the bleaching means that it becomes white because after the zooxanthellae is lost, the coral tissue becomes translucent and you see the underlying calcium carbonate structure of the coral, which is white. So that's why we call it bleaching. So that's where the zooxanthellae resides, within the coral polyps, and that's basically what happens during the bleaching events. So panelists would expand on this later. So eventually the corals die. So there are not only corals, there are many other groups that are affected as a result. All organisms that contain these zooxanthellae begin to get affected and they die off. So corals, hard corals, soft corals, clams, sea anemones, sponges, zoanthids, corallimorpharians, they all suffer from this problem. So there have been bleaching events reported since the 1870s, but they have not been frequent. These are, far, far apart. Then bleaching increased in the 70s, greater than 60 between 79 and 90. The first major global event occurred in 1998, which Sri Lanka also suffered a lot, particularly in the Indian Ocean. And then there was another major event in 2015 and 16 that you may have heard about, the Great Barrier Reef dying as a result of that. So this is all linked to the southern oscillation, El Nino and the southern oscillation. It starts off in the South American coast in the Pacific, And it is so termed because it generally reaches full strength towards the end of the year. So the early Christian inhabitants of the western equatorial South America equated the warm water current that comes with it and the resulting impact on their holiday celebrating the birth of Jesus, known as El Nino in Spanish. So that's where the origin comes of this. And then there are two cycles. This warm water spreads on the western side. It spreads towards the Indo-Pacific area, and then there is a La Nina phase, which is the cooler water going back. Yeah, Sri Lanka is generally affected during this La Nina phase, which happens in the middle of the year, around May-June period. So the first large-scale bleaching event which was linked to this was reported in 1982-83 period, and the first global event in 98. So the 2015 and 16 there was a super El Nino which caused a lot of coral damage, also part of the death of the barrier reef. So it was estimated that 22% of the barrier reef was affected as a result, and this was also a major cause of coral bleaching in Sri Lanka. So this is what it looked like. In fact, many areas in Sri Lanka was affected as a result, especially the Bar Reef, which was a famous place for tourism, was also very badly bleached, and now it is in very poor condition. So IPCC reported that unless we reduce the carbon dioxide emissions, we are just going to have bigger problems, and eventually many of these reefs would disappear from what we know today. Then ocean acidification due to carbon dioxide absorption by seawater is also going to reduce the calcification of many of these organisms, and their structures are going to be weaker, and therefore they will be badly affected as a result. So the basic requirements for damaged reefs to recover is good environmental conditions are required, the least amount of disturbance, high resilience to recover from these events, species that facilitate recovery, such as herbivorous fish, need to be there, and new larvae to settle and grow, and tissues that survive the bleaching to grow onto dead coral surfaces. And there may be other factors which will be elaborated. So thank you for that, giving me that opportunity to introduce. And over to Dr. Kamal.
Okay. Thank you so much, Arjan. So he has the most information about the coral reefs in Sri Lanka. He has been doing a lot of work on this. So actually, I was about to ask about the first question about the importance of coral. I don't want to elaborate anything. I think we already discussed this. But if everybody in this panel can give me some idea about, so how do you see this issue in the coral reef? Like when the first day you see in the coral, maybe 30 or 20 years back, and if you see something today, so that difference, if you can explain, so how much changes has been undergoing, and how you experience this, and with your work, how you can explain this? If you can start with the Turney.
So I am not going to repeat the same, but I will talk from my experience from my childhood. I started my snorkeling with fishermen when I was in schooling in Mirissa, first in 1983-4 period, when I was in grade 6-7. And at that time, the major issue was not climate change and no any talk about ocean acidification. There was nothing about that. But main issue was coral mining at that period. So in my village, just by the sea, we had one place called Maligawa. It's called, in simply called Maligawa. It's a coral nice patch. But within a couple of years time, I saw how Maligawa was taken down, broken down and brought back to the coast. I still remember how those small animals like crabs, they creep along the beaches to get back to the ocean. So there's no Maligawa at all in Mirissa, and all corals are almost dead in not only in Mirissa, but in the whole southern coast. From my estimation, I know that about in Sri Lanka for the moment about 80% or 90% of corals are gone. very few places we can observe living corals, especially in northeast part, and again some small patches in down south and some patches in the small patch in western northwestern area. Now the main culprit for the coral destruction is fishing practices and again pollution plus climate change. Those three have the cumulative effect. But on the other hand, the ocean and the corals are very much important for us. You know, in our planet, the 2/3 of planet is covered by the ocean, and about 95% of the biosphere is contained in the ocean. On the other hand, being at the Forestry Symposium, I must say that about 50 to 80% of oxygen is released from the ocean. At the same time, 30% of carbon dioxide is absorbed by the ocean, and corals again contribute to that both. And we need corals. For the country, not the country, the whole planet, we need corals because they are one of the important ecosystems, or one of the important animal group in the ocean, and they keep a very high balance and they maintain that ecosystem balance. So at present, from my understanding, we have lost most of them. We have to act quickly, and we are almost late for the moment. Even now we are late. So I think this symposium will be an eye-opener, this discussion will be an eye-opener, what sort of problems we are having at the moment and what sort of actions we can take and where we get bottlenecked. Therefore, I think since we have limited time, I open the floor to others also, they can give some experience from their side. But still from MIPA, from Marine Environment Protection side, we have taken some actions from MIPA and again from the university side. I will discuss that later, but for the moment, from our experience, we will discuss what are the present status of corals from our experience.
If you go to the Prasanna, Weerakkody, Mr. Prasanna, if you can share your experience.
Yes. My first love affair with reefs was in Ursulas. And at that time, that reef was, it's a little cove enclosed within the Ursulas hill. And you go and you will park up there for a couple of days on the beach camping out. And sometimes you wouldn't see a human on that beach for the whole day. And the thing was the quality of the reef, the amount of fish that you would see on the reef. And there was no space on the ground that was not covered with coral. I mean, some life form, not the algae or dead reef, but it was dense pack of coral and so much diversity. And through several decades, we watched the reef completely dying out, right, into nothing. Actually, even the substrates were taken out. So that's what we have seen from those days to now. And in the early 90s, my partner at that time, Ranathunga and I, we used to take a bet when we go diving, who's going to record most fish on that day. And the usual numbers are between 225 to 275 species per day fish, right? We wouldn't count 50 to 100 now, in a good day, right? So that's the diversity loss we have suffered within that time. So, we saw the processes that went through. Like Turney said, initially it was only human impacts, The biggest threat was coral mining. Then ornamental fishing came up, netting came up. So the priorities of marine conservation or reef conservation keep changing till we came to mid-90s. And then suddenly we start seeing other things happening. Natural processes killing the reef at a far higher rate than the human processes. Like I think the first this thing was in around 1996 we started seeing invasive species coming onto the reefs. Acidians, and I think it was around 97 we had several reefs going under Helimeda, Hikkaduwa, Unawatna and Polhena. So from there onwards, a series of invasive species attacking the reefs we were seeing, then the bleaching events coming. So from the human impacts, we have started changing into the natural processes killing the reefs at a far higher rate and at an uncontrollable pace. So, and that's what has brought us to this point.
Nishan, if you can share your experience, how you started and what you see today in coral reefs.
I think my story is very similar to, sadly, to many of us here on the panel. I always tell people when I meet them that as unfortunate or sad as it is to see something like this kind of disappear or get degraded, I consider myself very fortunate to have been potentially been the last generation, being just marginally younger than the earlier two others, most of the others on the panel. Probably the last generation in Sri Lanka to see what you would call relatively intact reefs with fairly high biodiversity, especially on the south coast, but also in other parts of the country, including the northwest Bar Reef and the east coast. Unfortunately, the northern section was not an area we could access much. So the story is pretty much the same, and the issues. Obviously, everything has got worse with the climate change impacts. But I think one of the things that we have to keep focus when we look into the future, which is the only way we should be looking now, is that while climate change and global warming impacts are kind of complex and difficult for us to deal with, I mean, there is no single management effort that we can take to mitigate that. You have to bear in mind that the human impacts that were major issues then, barring potentially coral mining, everything else continues and have potentially got worse, from pollution to fishing impacts. It's not that they have gone away, it's just that there is this bigger threat that seems to override that. So I think one of the key things while focusing on climate change that we need to start focusing on what we can control. Controlling or managing our fisheries, managing or reducing pollution, or how humans interact directly with the reef is one thing we can control. There are many success stories of countries that do it, and I don't see why Sri Lanka cannot, barring maybe political interference. But it can be done, and having a healthy reefs ecosystem that is not compromised by human actions directly will make them more resilient to climate change. Of course, sometimes the healthiest of reefs, with every condition as we saw in '98 in the Bar Reef and some places, it might get knocked out. But they also recover. I mean, the Bar Reef is a fantastic example of how a reef can come back. Within 8 to 10 years, the reef had a very high coral cover from '98 to around 2007-8. Of course, it's got degraded again. The key I think we have to focus on is providing the environment and giving these ecosystems the space for them to naturally regenerate, while climate change might intensify and they might knock out, but at least focusing on preserving certain resilient pockets that can be kind of the last refuges or vestiges. I think that's where the focus should be on. But of course, climate change itself is, I mean, it's a complex issue. There's no one answer for that.
Arjan, I think you must have a long history. If you can, if you can short it down to a couple of minutes, how you started and how you see the reefs now.
I will start from where Nishan started. He said that he would be the in the last generation. Well, I've been luckier because I started diving around early 1970s and was snorkeling in the 1960s in my school days. So I'm the oldest in the panel. And because of that, I consider myself lucky in this particular situation, because I've seen most of those reefs in what they were looking like, or they should be. So all those things are gone now, as Prasanna said. It's, for me, diving now is something that is very sad, because I was first attracted to the ocean because of its beauty, because of the colorfulness of the reefs, the large fish that were there, and like shoals of fish. Now you don't see a fragment of that right now, a fraction of that, because everything is gone. I'll just give you one example of how exports have actually played a huge role in this. The reefs off Colombo, they are not 100% coral, but these are old sandstone or limestone reefs. But they were full of lobsters, a particular species of lobster that loves kind of sedimented freshwater inflow areas. It's called Panerivirus homerus. There were so many of these lobsters those days in the 60s that you could just go out snorkeling and in about half an hour you can catch a gunny bag during daytime. Lobster being a nocturnal animal. There were so many. But today you will swim 1 kilometer and catch one lobster. That's the way the exports have had an impact on this population of lobsters. Yeah. And the price. In the 60s and 70s, we didn't have many tourist hotels. So lobsters were sold to about 3 places: Golf Face, Mount Lavinia, and I think there was a Taj. And those days we used the imperial measures, so it was a pound. 1 rupee and 25 cents a pound. But today, a kilogram of lobster of the highest grade will be somewhere around 5,000 rupees. So catching 2 lobsters, you're okay. Those days, you had to catch 2 gunny bags to be okay. So if you want to make the same amount. But then, of course, you know the currency's valuation. So it was a complete disaster, in fact. Not only lobsters, there were many species on reefs that have so many linkages to other species in the food chain, and we are exploiting them at a very, very rapid rate. And we are not managing that exploitation. And as a result, the entire ecosystem is suffering. And why is it important to maintain that? Because, as the early Nishan and Prasanna and Turney said, when climate change or some other event happens, they need to come back. The reefs need to come back. To come back, they must have this balance in them. Without that balance, they are not going to come back. So my experience is that it's a sad experience. It was a happy experience at one time, now it's a sad experience. So with that, I'll stop now and you can move on. Thank you.
I think I can move to Asha now. I know you are not very much coral person, but when you are looking for some whales, perhaps you might encounter some corals somewhere. So what is your...
I mean, I'll talk about the corals as well, because I mean, I have, while I don't work actively like all these gentlemen here, who are all older than me, I want to point that out. Apart from that,
Not by much.
I don't actively work in coral reefs, but I have, as a marine biologist, marine conservationist, it's a space that I obviously go into for various reasons. And one of them is for teaching purposes. And we ran a field course for 10 Sri Lankan students, university level students, and we took them to Pigeon Island. We ran classes and then we took them out to see these coral reefs. And I have to say the saddest part was like, some of them had never snorkeled before, and their first experience of snorkeling, they were pointing out bleached corals, right? So like to me, that was heartbreaking, because I was thinking like, this is the first they'll ever see of this magnificent structure that's so incredibly important to our ecosystems. And their first encounter is basically bleached coral, right? And it's not how I remember it as well. Like when I went there many years ago, you know, there were lots of fish around and stuff. You can see that decline. And I'm not saying that I go and monitor and I can give you numbers like the rest of them. But just as a person who's gone into those spaces, I can see that difference. And yeah, for me, like that was really poignant when those kids, when the students were like, miss, that bleached coral, you know, and then I was like, wow, like this is what you're going to take home, right? But then apart from that, like what we need to remember is while coral reefs only cover about 1% of our ocean floor, which is a really tiny percent, right? That's very small. About a quarter of all the fish that around the world, like they spend some part of their life cycle in coral reefs. So these coral reefs are really important, right? So we talk about these ecosystem services, we talk about the economic aspect as well, but the simple functions of the ocean depend on these ecosystems. They're there for a reason, right? They're there because they provide nursery grounds for species. That's why 25% of these species, quarter of what we, some of the fish that we eat, they spend part of their life cycle in these coral reefs because of the safety aspect of it. So as we destroy those spaces, that has knock-on effects, and that's what we have to think about. It's like, well and good, these coral reefs are going to vanish. These kids are never going to, the next generation might never know what a coral reef really looks like. But then on top of that, what are the other impacts that come with it, right? And that's, to me, something that's really important to think about. And as we talk about, this climate change impacts, and as Nishant says, now we have to focus on the heat-tolerant corals. A lot of effort is going into looking for the heat-tolerant and acid-tolerant, because acidification is a real problem that also destroys coral reefs. And so trying to identify species that can withstand these rising sea temperatures. But there's only small pockets of those in the oceans. And what's left behind can't actually perform all the functions that these massive coral reef structures were doing, right? So now our dependence is falling onto these small spots in the ocean. We can't keep up even with the regrowing, the efforts to regrow these heat-tolerant corals, for example. It's hard for us to keep up with the changes that are going on around us. So, as Nishan very rightly says, yes, climate change is a big problem. It's a complicated problem. We're all part of that problem. So, never forget, we can sit and wax lyrical about how terrible climate change is, but if you're not making an effort in your own life, then you're part of the problem, and we all are, right? But we also have to remember that there are all these other direct impacts. Like, you can go to a coral reef in Sri Lanka, we can see it's already falling apart, and nobody's doing anything about the fact that people are walking on those reefs, right? These reefs take decades to grow, like small amounts, yet we somehow we don't see the value unless we see a price tag on something. And I think culturally, that's something that has to shift as well. It's like, how do we see our natural environment? Why do we have to have a monetary label on it for us to believe that is keeping us alive? And most of our oxygen is generated in the oceans, right? So if you don't care about the environment, I tell people this all the time, you don't care about the environment, that's fine, but worry about your own health and livelihood, right? Think about your children. Do you want them to live on a planet where they can actually breathe? And that's, to me, sort of the angle that we need to also start taking, is talking not just about protecting things in isolation, but first of all, talking to more people about the problems, so everyone has the opportunity to become a more responsible citizen. But also really kind of making people more responsible in the sense of reminding them that we are all part of this problem. We can be part of the solution, but we also need to collectively sort of think about how do we shift this culture of mindset. And it's not just coral reefs. For me, it's every resource we have in this country we take for granted. And that's why we're in the situation we're in, right? And so we need to shift that. And to me, it starts from education in schools. And while we can teach subjects to kids, I think we need to start talking about things like ethics and morals, and how we respect not just each other, but also this other species that we share this planet with. Because it's not us against nature, we are part of nature. And that, to me, is really important to remember.
Next question, or you're trying to actually dig into a little bit further. Like, now we know that there are actually two components in the issue, like the anthropogenic part and the climate change part, right? So of course it's so hard to disintegrate these two. I mean, these are very interconnected. But if we try to at least take, like, what are the major anthropogenic stresses? Of course we know, but in local context, which one is affecting more if you take in that context? So which anthropogenic threats are actually affecting most? If Arjan, would you be able to elaborate on this aspect? So
thank you. As you correctly say, that there are many factors, but in the experience that I have on working on these reefs for a long time while I was at Nara, in fact I was lucky enough to see almost all the reefs around Sri Lanka. I was able to dive on almost all of them. even during the wartime, and then some areas that we couldn't get to during the wartime, we have done afterwards, like the Pork Bay, Fox Strait and so on. The rate that we are taking out species and also over-harvesting and the use of destructive methods is very, very high. And these reefs have no chance of recovering if we go on in that way. There are nearshore areas that is affected by pollution and what's happening on land, deforestation, increased sediment, and so on. At the same time, there may be agricultural pollution as well. Not only what we see in terms of plastics and all of that, but what is the unseen, the nitrogen that comes in, that promotes growth of algae and so on. But from a physical sense, extraction, destructive methods, those are the biggest problem as I see it today, and difficult to manage because unfortunately Sri Lanka has allowed all of these to expand. If you look at the fishing industry, we have thousands and thousands of small fiberglass boats that can go only up to a certain distance from the shore without boat motors. They have been given as subsidies by the Department of Fisheries on many occasions as the government changes and so on. And then these are also equipped with nets, unlimited amount of nets. So people are laying nets for everything that is there, catching the last one that is swimming, basically. That's what is happening. So we are catching the bottom dwelling fish, we are catching the mid-water fish, we are catching the surface dwelling things. And there's severe competition. And then on top of that, we harp about export earnings. Increase more and more export earnings. But we are not doing anything to actually regulate them. To bring this point home a little more, I'll just add one thing. Most of our fisheries management, unfortunately, is done from the land. 99% of the fisheries inspectors do not go out to sea. So we can have enough laws on land, restrictions, regulations, but we have no control what is happening out in the offshore area. So this is the situation. Unless we change that, we have no hope of controlling anybody out in the ocean. So I'll just, I think I have highlighted this factor. Then of course we also discussed about other factors that have come into play later. For example, like the climate change and pollution and so on. So thank you.